This is the Pro Perspective from Houzz Pro, where home builders, designers, and industry experts share their views on running a modern firm.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Pro Perspective. I'm Liza Hausman, and today we have the great privilege of speaking with author, coach, and remodeling industry guru Mark Richardson about what we can learn from the past year and what's important to know for a successful 2026. So, big welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Liza. Great to be with you.
Great to have you. I think one of the things that we've talked about, and people may still be scratching their head about, is kind of what happened over this last year. So maybe you can recap for us your thoughts on what we can take away from 2025.
So I would just to understand 25, I think probably even kind of rewind just slightly further down to 24. I think coming out of COVID, where we were starting to see the dust settle at many different fronts, and we got into 2024. And, I know with several of my friends at, Harvard in the industry, I think there was a fair amount of consensus that 2024 was going to be a year of uncertainty, certainly because of the presidential election, what was happening certainly all around the world and so many different fronts. And, homeowners and the overall sentiment of homeowners were, that they may have been doing fine and okay, but the environment out there was making them a little nervous, and therefore, when anybody's ever nervous, obviously it has an impact on consumer confidence. So overall, the theme of 2024 was a year of uncertainty. And when we moved into 25, as I kind of really reflected on a lot of things and looking into 2025, the LIRA leading indicator of remodeling activity was certainly a positive, not a negative one. I looked at it and said, okay, after the presidential election, as much as it was, pretty involved for some people, I think, I felt like the dust was settling a little bit. And my theme for 2025 was a year of mastery. And it was really a matter of, okay, we don't know whether it's going to rain or sunshine, but we do know that we can become more masterful because, I think homeowners out there clearly there was a lot of pent up interest on their part. But as we got into the year, and certainly after, the election or after the presidency and the transfer there, we found just so many things that were going on that, I think this notion of uncertainty kind of continued playing. And my shift to my theme for 2025, which was, it's a year of mastering the uncertainty. And I bring that up because I think what we've experienced this year for so many companies, it's not been a bad year. Matter of fact, I'd say 75% of the companies I'm engaged with are actually having quite good, and in some cases, a record year. You just wouldn't necessarily know it. However, it is the case. But those are the companies that are out there that are, I think are really approaching and realize that, it's okay out there, but it's really a hard environment to be in.
And when you say it's a hard environment, tell us a little more about what that means.
Well, as up at a recent Harvard meeting, one of my panelists was, Michael Sori from the Washington area, and he described this year, 2025. It was a lumpy year, and in his mind, lumpy meant you'd go for 2 or 3 weeks, and the phone would be ringing, and everybody was very optimistic, and oh my goodness, everything's going to be great, and then they'd go for another 2 or 3 weeks that if the phone stopped ringing, clients were pausing on projects, pushing back. So it was very lumpy in that it never really had traction and really was consistent and sustainable. It was peaks and valleys. So it was very, very lumpy year. But, like I said, when you look at it in the kind of holistically, I think it's played itself out just fine.
We talk often in terms of headwinds and tailwinds. Did the headwinds and tailwinds for 2025 shape up to be what you expected or what companies expected them to be?
I would say for the most part, there was obviously some major curveballs that got thrown in. I mean, even the word tariff, we didn't really even think about it till, the beginning or into Q1, Q2 of this year, that it became, probably the biggest word that was out there on the part of the not only the consumer, but certainly the remodeling community. So I would say that this year, when you look at it in its entirety, I think it's for the most part played out the way that we had imagined it. But the journey to get there just was, was very messy. It was very wonky. It was very, kind of shifting back and forth. So, I think the good news is, and there's a lot of data that obviously you guys are very focused on the data, but one of the data points that I think about is from Cleveland Research, where they talked about, that 80% of the homeowners that are doing the major remodeling, 80% of them are actually saying, they're better off now than they were 2 or 3 years ago. So the homeowners out there, they have the funds, they have the means to be able to do it. And I think at the end of the day, that's going to be what the real driver is, because their home really continues to be, their most important, I think, asset. And as that most important asset, they're going to have to continue to invest in it. And if they have the means to invest in it, it's more a matter of just when they do it, not whether they do it.
Got it. And did you see that, maybe among the companies you've worked with or some that you've talked with, was there anything that they did in particular that helped them address the lumpiness or address that inconsistency or have that banner year that you think is useful to share?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the sales process, I think that they realized that time was not on their side. They had to act more quickly. I think they had to realize that homeowners today do, in fact, appreciate, having a little bit more technology edge about you. And therefore, they didn't keep that a secret, that that's, in fact, how they did business in terms of some of the different technologies that they were using in their business. They were also, I think since we've seen so much remodeling inflation, meaning, the cost of that kitchen going from, 100 to 125 to 200,000 and even above, right now, that there's so much inflation. I think, many homeowners out there are saying, I just want to have my new kitchen. I don't mind compromising on a few of the finishes or a few of the brands. And therefore, I think we're definitely seeing, a lot more emphasis on selling down, not necessarily selling up like we saw in decades in the past.
Interesting. So I'm curious, as we shift to looking forward into 2026, do you have a theme yet for 2026? And how are you starting to think about it?
I don't have, I think, a really well articulated theme yet, but I do think it's going to be a theme of growth. And growth, as you certainly know, and I think most people listening to this, can be defined in a lot of different ways. But I do think that the companies out there that are growing are going to gain market share and gain traction, whether it's in terms of revenue or whether it's client base or whether it's even in terms of talent. And those that are, tail between their legs, hunkered down, they're gonna slide backwards. So I do think it's gonna be a year of growth, and that growth is gonna be a take it kind of growth, not it's just gonna naturally come to them. Many of the companies I'm working with, are definitely turning up the dial or on their marketing efforts. They're approaching their client experience and their client base as being, so much of an important asset to their company. I think that diversification within the businesses, I think, are happening creating the client for life. Therefore, what else can I do for the client than just do the kitchen or bathroom or the addition or what I've done in the past, whether it's in small projects, whether it's in other services that you're providing for the clients. But I definitely feel that, it's going to be a year of growth. And, those that are not necessarily on the growth train might find that, by the end of 26, 27, they're not only going to not be able to maintain where they are, but they're going to probably lose market share unless they're a little bit more aggressive there.
No, that's a very, I guess, bold and bracing prediction. And I think you're probably right. I think there's a growth mindset that sounds like you're talking about in terms of the attitude and the actions that people need to take to drive growth. Are there, what do you see as the key forces, kind of, like maybe it's the headwinds and tailwinds, but what do you see happening in 2026 that are either going to, help bolster growth or will be a challenge to growth or things that need to be addressed?
Well, I think there's internal and then there's external kind of elements of growth. On the external elements of the growth, I think that it's really, really critical that, companies put the right calories and energy into their marketing efforts in terms of, really getting the phone to ring, having the right level of prospects. I think there's going to be kind of a nice balance between the higher touch kind of marketing efforts and the higher tech kind of marketing efforts. I think that, many companies over the last, especially during COVID with, kind of the go-go remodeling activity that was happening, I think they got a little bit lazy on the marketing efforts, but more specifically on the higher touch kind of marketing efforts. So I think there's going to be a lot of energy really devoted to that. If in fact they're able to control the opportunities and the lead flow, then I think it's going to be critical that you really sharpen your axe in terms of what do you do with the opportunity when it comes to you. I think training, I've always believed, but I think going into 26, I'm hearing a lot more buzz on training is really more of an investment than it is an expense. And therefore, I think you're going to see a lot more energy devoted to sales training and internal training and client experience and all of those things. And then I think, kind of moving along through from the sales process into production, you make your money on what you build, not necessarily what you design and specified. So therefore, I think that operational excellence that is going to have to happen on that side of it is going to be a real priority. So it's going to be really, when I talk about growth, I'm really talking about, all of those things, but also I think that with those companies that are really focused holistically on that full process, that full kind of pipeline moving all the way through, I think are going to see the best outcomes.
Yes, it's interesting on the marketing front. We're hearing both kind of as you said, the tech side, as well as the high touch piece of it, coming into play. One of the things that's come up and we get a lot of questions about is, for example, search engine optimization in the land of AI. So we call like answer engine optimization or AEO. And one of the things that we're finding that we're actually able to help with is having the right information come up when people are querying and getting AI results, because it is significantly different. Whereas search results, you just see a listing of a website and then you'd go to that website, that builder or remodeler's website to get the details. Instead, right now you're getting an AI summary with a summary of what that business is all about. And so it does require a different type of optimization than folks were doing in the past. So everything they were doing in the past is still great, but there are additional things to do. And I think that's, definitely an interesting part of it. And then, yes, when you're finally getting to speak to somebody, right, then it gets into that personal relationship and how you're handling the high touch and how folks feel about the experience. And I'm actually about to remodel my kitchen, and so I feel like I'm living that experience myself as a homeowner in terms of the very different experiences I've had with different remodelers coming into my home and meeting with me, and not necessarily all being the same or even consistent among
Yeah,
themselves.
I heard an interesting way to think about this recently, or about a year ago, that I think really puts it in perspective. And that is, about 20, 25 years ago, homeowners were only about 20% of the way through the process at the time that they called the remodeler. Whereas today, they're 80% of the way through their process by the time they're calling. So I think it really changes how you think about those touch points, how you think about leveraging AI and certainly technology, because, today, and I'm kind of a master of the obvious, while people are sitting watching their Netflix, they're also, doing all their research. They're not necessarily meeting with anybody, but they're doing all their research. And today, to your point about leveraging AI, the adoption of AI, another little tidbit I heard recently, that the internet adoption took about 20 years, and with AI, it's taken about 2 years. And when you think about the speed at which that's happening, and the searches that people are doing, they're searching through, chat, they're searching through other AI platforms, and what's coming back is information that's really different from some of their traditional searches that they were doing before. I was on a board meeting. I'm on the board of the Better Business Bureau in the Mid-Atlantic, and I was on a board meeting, and then they were sharing that if in fact you, let's say, are a member and are accredited in the Better Business Bureau, AI actually picks that up and makes that part of, positioning your company as being one of the better companies as opposed to one of the worst companies. Well, that's not necessarily the criteria that Google may have gotten or used, or some of the others. So, you need to really, quite frankly, all those touch points that you're doing to make sure that you are in fact the best, the best you can look, will in fact, I think, influence whether and how people contact you moving forward.
Yep, absolutely. Exactly what we see, for example, those AI search results bringing back reviews, like from your Houzz profile, right? It's pulling from a lot of different
100%.
places to summarize. So definitely different. Yes, I definitely see AI as a key force for the next year. I think, we recently put out an AI report where we surveyed construction firms, and we found that, a third of construction firms are already using AI for their businesses, and two-thirds of those with 10 plus employees are using AI for their business consistently. So I'm curious, are you hearing that from the businesses that you work with? Our approach has been to, and we go out and talk about this a lot, but there's sort of two ways that you can adopt AI. There's a whole bunch of standalone tools, right? The chat GPTs and the Nana Bananas, and where you're going to have to take your information and feed it to chat GPT. And then there are things where AI is already integrated. So, right, whether you're using Waze or Alexa or any of these other tools, right, the AI is built right in. And that's kind of been our approach from a software standpoint. But I'm interested to hear, I guess, what you're hearing and your take on AI's impact in the next year or beyond.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. AI is certainly the hottest thing out there right now. I think in terms of, kind of the buzz that's going on. What's interesting though, and I've led a couple of, discussion groups about it, is how different companies, how different individuals, leaders, what have you, are processing it. I think what I'm finding, those that are approaching it in the most successful ways are the ones that are kind of building the right culture around AI. They're putting the right disciplines in place. They're putting in the right amount of calories, because very quickly we're going to get to a point where if you don't look at it more holistically within your business, you're going to have, some individuals within the business that are way ahead of the learning curve, and some you're dragging behind, and therefore it's going to become problematic. The biggest thing I've seen with, in terms of a reason why you should, in addition, just staying up with the times, is the amount of cost that you can kind of extract out of things by leveraging AI is tremendous. One company that I work with that was doing a lot of videos in traditional ways, literally 2 years ago, they did some analysis and it was costing them about $2,400 per video. By leveraging, AI tools in what they're doing now, it's more like $200 or $300 per video.
Yep.
So you can get your costs down, design, leveraging it in the design process. It's just amazing how quickly you can get clients to make decisions if in fact you're leveraging AI. So it's not a question of whether you do it. If you don't do this one, there's no question you're going to fall way behind.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I do think it's a huge growth driver. And it's interesting that you mentioned adoption and getting it into the culture, because I think that's been a problem with technology in general, right? Is just driving adoption across the team consistently and making sure that you're really getting the value out of it. One of the things we're hearing also are firms talking about really AI as a way to improve job satisfaction and retention, because it's able to take time out, right? To minimize admin work or the amount of typing, right? That it allows your team to focus on the work product and the clients, right? Which is where the job joy is and where the actually, right, your money is made. And so I think it's one of the ways to talk to, for anyone out there that is having some resistance from their team to adopting technology of any kind, right? I think it's positioning it as a way to reduce the kind of the admin work and the less interesting work to be able to focus on the things that they enjoy.
Yeah, no question about it. And, I just would encourage, anybody listening to this, if you're not spending, and I'm talking about the learning curve, if you're not spending 20 or 30 minutes a day just bringing yourself up the speed of, different uses, different processes, different technologies that are out there, then I think you're going to fall short very quickly, because the reality is, even your children are going to be so much further ahead of where you are in terms of the adoption of it. And there's really no reason for that.
So we talked about how there's a growth mindset, or right, this theme of growth. What are some of the habits that you think folks out there should probably either develop or foster among themselves as leaders or among their teams that could help with this growth mindset and help them take advantage and not fall behind?
Yeah, I think what I find in working with a lot of companies, I think there's a certain obsession by companies for their 1 year plan. And I remember reading a long, long time ago, I think it was Jim Collins or one of the major authors. He said there's two time frames that you should be thinking about, your business more than ever. One is a 10-year time frame, and one is a 3-month time frame. And that's always resonated for me. But I bring it up because I think by spending more time with the vision, the 10-year is, am I going to the mountains or going to the seashore? What's the vision? What is my, what do I care about? What are my values? What are my purpose? All those kind of things, and having real clarity and making sure your team, your leadership, and other members of your team aligned on where we're heading. And then, there's so much unpredictability, uncertainty out there. Don't fall in love with your 1 year plan. Try to focus on a shorter scale plan. Yes, of course, you need a budget for the year. Of course, you need a plan for the year. But what you really need is a 12-week year. You really need a 1 quarter plan that you can execute on and really be able to measure very, very carefully. So I think one recommendation I would encourage, especially in light of, not knowing whether it's going to rain or shine, next month or this or what's going to happen in terms of some of the global issues or some of the political issues. Really focus on quarter by quarter by quarter. Okay, how does it fit with my longer term vision? But what is it? What are the goals? What do we need to accomplish? What do we need to get through this quarter? And so on and so on. And I think when you start to build those quarters on top of each other, I think you're going to be much closer to getting where that longer term vision and goal is for yourself.
I think it's always interesting if folks are focused on a one year plan. It's good to hear a different way to look at it. And I like that idea of having that big longer term picture, but then having, a horizon you can see, right, that you're measuring and working towards. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I oftentimes think of it, Liza, a little bit like driving to that in the horizon, the mountains are out there. You need to know what is immediately around you. You need to know kind of that exit coming up in a quarter mile, half a mile. But you also need to keep an eye on kind of where you're heading and make sure that you're looking at these different intervals in the right kind of fashion and not too focused right on the hood of the car or not focused so far out that you end up, either in a traffic jam or getting in a wreck.
You talked earlier about the sales process, and we touched on it. Has the consumer changed? How are you seeing folks adapt or adjust their sales process to this, kind of hurry up and then wait and the lumpiness, or just, the situation we're in now where you do have folks with means, but they have other options for their money if they don't want to renovate, right? They can go on vacation or do other things that are going to be less painful. What are you seeing that needs to be a focus for teams this coming year when it comes to sales?
Yeah, I think in your sales process, and there are many things that I think you the best way to think about, I think, your sales process is you need to pivot, not change. And I think when you really look at the environment we're in, we need to have 1-2 degree pivots here and there in terms of our process. I think of an example of that is there's so much anxiety and stress out there. I think your sales process, you need to be a little bit more patient. Why? Because there's a lot of herky jerkiness out there. And I think, if you can be a little bit more patient, I think this theme I heard, today more than ever, things are, highly human and extremely personal. Make it human, make it personal in your sales process. Don't just make it a rote kind of exercise. Don't try to qualify that client, judge that book by the cover too early in the process. Let that leash go out further than you would normally. I'm also a believer that I've already mentioned that, try to find ways that they can save, not necessarily spend more. I think more than anything, you're an advocate. You have to be the voice of reason. And the voice of reason is reason. You've got to weave logic into what you're selling today. For example, if a client is thinking about moving or remodeling, you might point out to them that, the act of moving is generally 10 to 20% of the cost of the new home. So if they're thinking about spending $500,000 on a project or even 100, doesn't matter what it is, that's a lot of money that is going to go into the act of moving with real estate commissions, with moving costs, transfer fees, with, fixing the old house up to prepare for it. So by using data in terms of remodeling inflation, in the last 5 years, according to Remodeling Magazine, we've seen remodeling inflation be 10 to 20% per year. Now, that's a huge amount. Tariffs, for example. Homeowners are out there talking sometimes about the tariffs, certainly less now than they were 6 months ago, but that only represented, I think, for most remodeling companies, 3 to 5% of the cost of a remodeling project. Whereas if in fact they delay the remodeling project, it's going to end up costing 10 to 20% more per year. So the more I think in the sales process that you can pepper in logic and data, help them buy. Don't just try to sell them. And I think more times than not, they're going to come up with, if you're more the voice of reason, they're going to come up with the right company to work with to be able to guide them through the process. And your real competition, I think, more than ever, is not other remodelers. It's the client fears, it's the client ignorance, and certainly the client's overwhelm.
Well, one thing I will add to that I think it's important for remodelers to know, and we recently ran a survey of homeowners in the middle of a renovation, and we found that only 14% were pausing or canceling their plans, and even those that were doing so were just doing it because the timing wasn't convenient for them. They all have extremely strong equity positions. They're all confident about moving forward, and that's at all income levels. And they're also, in many cases, expanding the scope. We also found that they were pretty clear-eyed about the challenges, including the higher labor and material costs. The one thing that we saw that showed up high on consumer concerns lists, like, hey, we asked them, what are the challenges that you expect? But when we asked remodelers, what do you think your homeowners, your clients' concerns are, didn't show up on their list was just disruption to their daily lives. And I think that's important, that for remodelers to know that, again, the consumers are confident they have the means, but that disruption to their daily life is pretty significant. And it's an important thing to address in the marketing and sales process.
Yeah, I work with a group in Michigan, and one of their kind of key project development folks says to every single client, how much space do you have in your life today or in the future for this project? And it's kind of an odd question to ask, but as the pause there, she goes on to say, in working with us, I need 1 to 2 hours a week. In working with others, if you want to try to tackle this yourself and coordinate everything, you're going to need 10 to 20 hours a week. So your issue of disruption, I think disruption is in fact discomfort, but it's also their time is disruptive. I know, for example, this summer I did projects, a lot of remodeling around my own immediate home. And I work with a diverse group of folks, and the folks that were, more of the, the requiring a lot of supervision literally caused me from not being able to go on certain trips this summer because I had to be here watching over things. And that's very disruptive. It's not just dust that's disruptive, it's disruption in your life.
Exactly. 100%, right? It is. It's that disrupt. They said
So
disruption
who
to
you
my daily
pick,
life. Yeah.
who you pick. I was just on a session with a group in Rhode Island, and one of their top gun salespeople says to every client that, in working with our design build or working with our approach, it's kind of like going to, a really fine dining restaurant where it's completely, A to Z the experience versus you going out, buying all those ingredients yourself, carving out the time to prepare and cook them yourself. That's really the difference. And doesn't mean one is better than the other, but they're not the same. So if in fact you choose this path, expect it to be that white glove experience.
It's interesting because, in addition to that sort of uncertainty, the other place that we hear from homeowners where they're looking for more is that visualization piece, being able to get more comfortable with what the finished product is going to be before they pull the trigger or sign a check. And we actually had a remodeler in our community send us a video the other day showing how they do their usual, right, the on-site visit. They sit down, they meet with the client, but now instead of just having the sit down, he goes off while his team is sitting with the client. He scans the existing space, using our LiDAR tool, and sits down, and within 10 minutes, he's able to then join that meeting and say, by the way, here's our starting point. And, is finding that has really supercharged their sales process because the client says, oh my God, and he's like, here's our starting point, and here's what we're going to be able to do. Even at a rough level, they're totally blown away, by what they're going to be able to see and how they're going to be able to visualize. And I'm curious your thoughts on, yes, you can need to just pivot your sales process, but I do think there are some interesting ways that remodelers are, finding ways to provide that white glove treatment to homeowners that isn't necessarily always just another phone call or attention or understanding their goals.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example. And several of the folks that I interact with, are certainly leveraging leveraging, your tools or tools that allow them very, very quickly to take client through the process. And again, I know I'm repeating myself. You're competing against client fears of making a mistake, ignorance. They don't know what it's going to look like or not going to look like, and they're overwhelmed. They don't have time to have 4 visits to talk about whether the cabinets are going to go to the ceiling or not. And the fact that you can leverage technology to be able to say, just like you described it, Liza, to be able to say in the moment when the client has a question, to say, I wonder what these cabinets would look like if they went all the way to the ceiling rather than a soffit. Well, let me show you. Boom. I like it that way. I'm not sure I like that, that inset door versus that overlay door. Boom. Let me show you what that would look like. Well, what about a cabinet that's a blue cabinet versus a white cabinet? Mm-hmm. Boom. I can show you immediately. And if you think about it, time kills deals. Time is not on your side in the sales process. And if you can actually do what you described and what I'm describing to be able to move the client along, just think about the level of stress the client has vaporized because of it. And you're not giving them any reason, if what you're proposing makes sense, any reason not to go ahead. So part of it is, yes, it's very impressive that it differentiates you. But I would also say it's also about how do you reduce the stress and be able to help the client move through their decision process.
Yes, and I think often folks don't realize, just like the video example you gave, technology has made the cost of some of these things, right? The cost has come down so much that now it's not I can only do this as a one-off for people who are already paying me, right? You can move it forward in your process and do it even before, right? You've got a signature rated. The cost has come down. And so I think it's good for folks to kind of say to themselves, hey, what are the pain points for homeowners, or what are the things that are blocking my sales process? And maybe there's a tool out there now that's going to help remove those blockades that maybe was previously unaffordable, right? From a labor or whatever it was reason, and is now something that I can do.
The other thing I might add to it, and I think with your suite of products, you certainly understand this, Liza, as well or better than most. And that is, don't only have it as tools, try to make it fun. Try to make it fun with the client, because if they're enjoying the journey and the process, the likelihood that they're going to want to continue it and not feel stressed about it is going to be so much greater. And I would argue, wow, make it a game that you're able to do this. Make it fun that you're doing this. And if you can make it fun, the likelihood that they're going to want to continue to have the fun and not be stressed out about it is going to be so much greater.
I love that. I think that's such an important point. All right, my final sort of question or direction on this growth theme is, what are we building for, right? What is the ultimate goal, right? Yes, you might have your 1-year plan, your 3-month plan, but we talk about that 10-year plan. How are companies thinking about that these days? And again, I'm growing to what end? Pass this company along, sell my company? What are you seeing out there, and how are they thinking about, what's next?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, and I think anybody listening to this, I'm not certainly surprising anybody, but you are aging out. Many of the remodeling leaders are aging out of their businesses. Some have transitions that they put into place, and others are scratching their head and kind of hanging in there, and they don't really know what that transition is. I'm a big believer that, and I know this seems like a long runway, but you should be, planning what that transition is, in fact, 10 years out. If you don't have 10 years, maybe it's 5 years out. But with those transitions, I know in my case, I was fortunate, many, many years ago, I had a very successful friend of mine that I asked him, so what's your next step? As he was focused on, his business. And he said, I'm looking for someone to fire me. And when he said that, I said, oh my goodness, that's kind of a scary thought. And then immediately I said, that's the key. You've got to have the person to fire you. You've got to have that next generation that you're putting in place. And I know after hearing that, I literally shifted almost overnight to be spending 10% of my time focused on the next generation to 30, 40% really mentoring and developing that next generation. And that's really the key, I think, if you're going to transition, whether it's with a family member or whether it's someone you grow into the business or whether you position and package the business to be sold. Unfortunately, most remodeling businesses are not very saleable. So I think that the easiest way for most full service remodeling businesses is doing it much more as an internal process.
All right. So if I was going to recap our conversation, Mark, I would say, 2026, year of growth and building a growth mindset. To do that, you're going to need a longer term vision clarity, but also a 3-month focus and the ability to manage to a horizon you can really work with and see. Building a culture is a key element to, embracing that growth mindset, and that includes technology. Marketing and sales need feeding. They need feeding that's both high tech and high touch, and to try to make it fun. So if your homeowners are enjoying the journey and process, the impact is bigger. I think that just is so important. And then finally, you got to think about your transition as a business owner, ideally 10 years out, 5 years at a minimum, because it's not, there's not, I guess, an obvious clear path for every business out there.
No,
Any
I think that's
thoughts? Yeah.
very well summarized. That without sounding too cliche-ish, I always wake up feeling very, very fortunate and kind of blessed that I chose kind of this path of being in the remodeling business. I think the reality is that, I think homeowners are not going to all of a sudden wake up and say, enough already. I don't want to live in a home. Let me go live in a cave or something. So, it's a business that you can, in fact, grow. It's a sustainable business, but it's also a business that is very, very fulfilling. You not only are creating amazing things, you're making some money at it, but you're creating a lot of joy out there by what you create. I remember hearing this little quote, business is a game. It's the greatest game in the world. I think the more you look at it like a game, have fun yourself. Games are fun. So make it a game and try to look at it that way. I think you can create something that is not only really, really cool for yourself, but it's really, wonderful for your clients as well.
I love that. No, we're lucky to have you, Mark, and I agree, lucky to work in this industry that has such a big impact on people's lives. And I agree, it generates so much joy and, life. So backdrop for your
100%.
life, right? For lives. So wonderful. Well, happy holidays and New Year and
Yeah, thank
everybody
you.
out there, and look forward to sharing this with everybody out there and to see you all soon. Hope we'll all see you all at IBS.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
This series is brought to you by Houzz Pro. To learn more about our best-in-class software for winning clients, managing projects, and simplifying your workflow, visit houzz.com/pro.